The way my argument about torture is mischaracterized is my argument is not about the ethical wisdom of torture. It's a comparison between torture and collateral damage. And if you could ever think of a circumstance where torture prevents collateral damage, then all of it, so we're all open to torture. I mean, we're all open to collateral damage because you have to wage any kind of war, right? Collateral damage just comes with war. But collateral damage is so much worse than most people realize or want to think about. And if you think of a situation in which torture would spare you collateral damage, well, then all of a sudden torture is on the table as something that ethically, and so you might think I mean, maybe we're out of time, but my conversation about torture is not just let's just start torturing people because it works and we should do it and who cares about its effects. It's collateral damage is so horrible, and however you align it with torture, it's worse. I think torture should be illegal across the board, but illegal is not the same thing as always unethical. Again, my argument about torture has several strands to it, but the core fact is that if you can't imagine a situation in which you would make someone uncomfortable so as to try to get information that you knew they had. There are situations where you know someone has information, right? Now, not every situation is like that, but you have to grant that there are situations where you know you're talking to the guilty guy, right? He might even claim to be the guilty guy. He claims he's got the information. Mm-hmm. He claims he's got a bomb that's going to go off, right? There are situations like this, and sometimes there are small situations that have nothing to do with the war on terror or I mean, they're just crime situations where someone has got somebody locked in a box somewhere, right? And he's not talking, right? If you can't imagine a situation where you would beat someone up so as to get them to talk, you're not thinking hard enough about the kind of evil people confront in this world. But it is another politically correct myth that torture never works and that people can just make stuff up out of whole cloth that then leads you on a wild goose chase to harm other people. There are certainly circumstances where that can happen, but you just have to imagine how these real world circumstances come about. You capture someone in Al-Qaeda along with his laptop, his hard drive. You have all, 10 years worth of emails, right? So you have a lot of information, and people, these people who are interrogating them, you can't just make stuff up, right? There's a ton of information here, and again, I'm not sanguine about the torture being a benign thing that we should do cavalierly. I think it should be illegal. I think if somebody does it in a circumstance that isn't in absolute extremity of where any decent person would be tempted to use force in this circumstance, then these people should be prosecuted and go to jail for decades, right? But there are circumstances where you would have to be a monster not to lay hands on the bad guy. I should say that my position on torture is exactly the position on torture that you find in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, right? And one thing that's happening to me now in conversations like this and on many topics is that much of my discussions have not to do with policy, but have been an effort to get at ethical bedrock. I mean, I write and think as a philosopher, mm-hmm. and in the context of having a philosophical discussion about ethics and right and wrong, you can say many things that seem crazy outside of a philosophy seminar, but in a philosophy seminar are totally legitimate. So in a philosophy seminar, you could say, why can't we eat babies? What's wrong with eating babies? If we've got extra babies around that nobody wants, why can't we eat them, right? That is a completely insane thing to say in the world, seemingly. That's the kind of thing that if quoted out of context, if Glenn Greenwald decides to tweet, Sam Harris can't figure out why we can't eat babies, right? It makes me look like an asshole. But the reality is that if you're talking about, if you're trying to get to the bedrock about the ethics of good and evil and the use of force, if you're trying to just then starting the conversation with why can't we eat babies? Give me an ethical argument about why this is really, really wrong. Why our intuitions of its wrongness can be conserved. That is a totally legitimate thing to do, and there's not a philosopher on earth who would think you were a weirdo for having that conversation. Mm-hmm. So much of my discussion, I don't tend to write down to my readers, and much of my discussion of things like nuclear deterrence and torture and all of these very inflammatory issues, or the biggest one is the link between belief and action, and killing people for their beliefs, right? Those are had in the context of a very extensive conversation in philosophical terms about how do we get to ethical bedrock? What makes it right to kill Osama bin Laden? How is it right? Is it right by virtue of all the people he's killed? Well, no, because we're not even sure he personally killed anyone, right? Is it right by virtue of all the people that Al-Qaeda killed already? Well, why? Because killing Osama bin Laden doesn't bring them back to life. It doesn't help anybody who's already been killed. It doesn't help their families. No, it makes sense based on what he's aspiring to do in the future. All the people we're going to hopefully prevent from being killed. So when you get to the bottom of that, as I was doing in this discussion about the link between belief and behavior, I am saying that you, in that case, you really are bombing his beliefs, right? It's the fact that you are sure he believes what he says he believes, and that those beliefs are going to lead to action, right? You're not bombing beliefs that aren't going to lead to action. It's the measure of the strength of the belief that connects it to action. It's an extensive conversation about the nature of belief and what beliefs are as programs of action, and I can defend every part of that argument, but it's hard to defend it when someone says, oh, you're just trying to kill people for thought crimes. No, I'm trying to get to an ethical justification for why it was okay to kill Osama bin Laden if we couldn't capture him. I'm not even someone who thinks he should have been killed. I think that he should have been captured. But if we couldn't capture him, killing him made sense not as retribution, as many people think. I mean, the logic of retribution makes absolutely no ethical sense to me. But it makes sense to prevent further harm. And when you look at the micro details of how you think you're preventing further harm, you were talking about what he believed and what he was going to do on the basis of his beliefs. And again, I'm paying a massive penalty for trying to have a fine-grained, intelligent, and quasi-academic discussion, and it's getting exported onto Twitter and into the minds of people like Glenn Greenwald and Reza Aslan, who don't want to engage with my argument closely enough to understand it, or they're quite happy to cynically mislead people as to what I'm actually saying. And I think it's in their case, I think it's the latter. But there are many people who are just confused by the norms of philosophical, ethical discourse, and they just don't say, well, how could you even be talking about eating babies? You monster, right? Right. These people don't know what it's like to be in a philosophy seminar, and that is largely the problem we're dealing with here, and it's made especially excruciating because many of these conversations abut public policy, right? So when you're talking about the ethics of torture, you're having that conversation in a world where there are people like Dick Cheney who are trying to figure out, whether we can have a policy of rendition, et cetera, et cetera.